Lecture 4. The Kazakh Economy. The Kazakhs were a pastoral nomadic people whose lifestyle was defined by their migratory, livestock-breeding economy. They had an established pattern of annual migration between their summer and winter campsites. The principal campsite was the Kstau, the winter site, at which the Kazakhs spent 4 or 5 months a year. This site was in a sheltered, wooded place, with water and grazing accessible. For the whole of this winter period the Kazakhs remained relatively immobile, grazing the animals nearby or feeding them with the limited grass and grain that they may have gathered or obtained through barter. Here, too, they erected their yurts and, in some communities, made shoshalasai mound-like residences of dirt, sticks, and stone. The long winter stopover allowed the Kazakhs to make the utensils, clothes, and personal possessions that they would need when the long trek resumed. Once the snows melted and the new grass had begun to grow, the Kazakhs began the spring migration, the koktu, to their summer pastures. Slowed by the still sparse grazing, they would travel for a few days and then camp where they found water, continuing this pattern until they reached the site chosen for summer pasture, usually in May or June. When these pastures were reached, all would generally divide into smaller units for more efficient grazing. The Kazakhs remained at the summer campsite, the Julu, until August or September. The campsite might be shifted within the same general area several times during the summer as grazing or water supply was exhausted. At the end of the summer the sub-alls reassembled and began the rapid autumn migration, kuzu, to the winter site. The distances involved in the annual migration varied by region, from 200 or 300 kilometers in southern Kazakhstan and semi-resh to as many as 1,000 kilometers in western and central Kazakhstan, where the annual cycle was rarely less than 700 kilometers. Although at this time fixed migratory paths were unknown, each tribe, which might consist of 100 alls or more, migrated within an established geographic zone. The alls remained in contact through a runner system known as the uzun kulak, long ear, which enabled them to orchestrate the migration as well as to warn one another of impending danger. Each Kazakh household maintained its own herd, which grazed in common with the other herds of the all. The Kazakhs bred mixed herds, primarily of sheep interspersed with goats, since they were relatively easy to maintain and were a source of both food and clothing. Next in importance were horses, necessary as beasts of burden and to carry the Kazakh cavalry. The Kazakhs of central and southern Kazakhstan used camels in place of horses. Cattle were relatively unknown in the steppe until the beginning of the 18th century, even then cattle were found almost exclusively in the north. The number of animals per family varied considerably within a community. Markov claims that in the first part of the 18th century an average family in the middle horde owned about 100 sheep, 30 to 50 horses, 20 to 25 goats, 15 to 25 heads of cattle and a few camels, whereas a wealthy family might own 10 to 20 times that number. Such wealthy households were, however, extremely rare. The greatest weakness of the Kazakh economic system was that of pastoral nomadism in general, dependence upon natural conditions. The very makeup of the Kazakh herd was determined by conditions. Sheep are relatively easy to maintain and eat most kinds of grass. In contrast, cattle require much greater quantities of grass and of more specific types, making it difficult to provide for a large free-ranging herd. The biggest problem that the Kazakhs faced was the starvation of livestock, usually from winter and its jut, ice storms that covered the grass with impenetrable ice. In bad years, a quarter to a half of a herd might perish. Drought was also a problem. The Kazakhs dug shallow wells along their migratory paths. During drought years these might dry up completely, while the water level in deeper wells that the Kazakhs dug at their winter and summer campsites dropped too low to support the entire herd. The water problem was magnified by the salinity of many steppe lakes and rivers. Despite these problems, the Kazakhs were committed to a pastoral, nomadic lifestyle. To be a Kazakh was to be a nomad, as the Kazakh language suggests. Kazakh has terms for those who do not migrate, such as balakshi, fisherman, ajinshi, grain grower, and the derogatory term jatak, literally, lie about, used to describe individuals who had lost their animals. In summer, jataks planted grain, wheat, barley, and millet, on communal land that they ate and sold for feed. The rest of the year they worked as hired hands, hoping to purchase or obtain livestock from their relatives. For the nomad and nomadism itself, Kazakh has no term. To the Kazakhs, land had no intrinsic value. Kazakhs owned their livestock but grazed these animals on common pasturelands over which tribes had usage rights but did not own. The primary impetus of Kazakh expansion was to secure grazing land, which the Kazakhs viewed as a depletable resource under temporary control. The basis of a man's wealth was his herd, not his land. The Kazakhs viewed farmers as their natural enemy, since agricultural settlements inhibited migration by otherwise employing potential pasturelands and claimed ownership to wells and water sources. Such settlements were raided when the Kazakhs needed grain, but the marauders were careful not to destroy them, since the oasis settlements of southern Kazakhstan were necessary as a place to barter and trade. The cities of the Syr Darya declined under Kazakh rule, because after the collapse of the Silk Road few traders from outside the steppe were willing to risk a trip across Kazakh-dominated territory. The trading needs of the Kazakhs themselves were quite minimal, and only Yasi had a sizable bazaar. Kazakh culture and religion. Kazakh culture and religion were heavily influenced by the nomadic economy. Their society was self-contained, without regard to the cities, and they sought to link customary practices to conditions of day-to-day life. The Kazakhs maintained cultural continuity with the practices of the Turkish tribes who had inhabited the area for the past millennia, and although regional and tribal differences existed, basic cultural homogeneity continued throughout the steppe as new tribes took up the dominant cultural practices. Even the Mongol tribes who remained in the area assimilated most of the local Turkic culture, while it is true, imprinting it with Mongol political culture and systems of law. Possibly the best proof of the stability of this Kazakh-Turkish culture was that popular religious practices were not deeply changed by Islam until the late 18th or 19th century, in spite of the fact that Islam was introduced to the cities of southern Kazakhstan in the 8th century, at the time of the Arab conquest, and that the Turkish nomads of the Kazakh steppe nominally embraced Islam in 1043. The Joshi prince who established the Kazakh state considered themselves Muslims and were accepted as such by the Muslim world. Those few Kazakhs who lived in the cities, mostly traders, did become practicing Muslims, but the pastoral nomads, the Kazakh masses and most of the Kazakh nobility, had only the sketchiest knowledge of Muslim tenets and practices. One reason for this stability was the relative self-sufficiency of Kazakh society. The Kazakh tribes were not closely tied to the cities, in whose seminaries and mosques Islam flourished. Sultans and khans were somewhat more religious, even including mullahs or seminary students in their entourages. Still, these Muslims served primarily as scribes and were generally unsuccessful in spreading the teachings of Islam. The Kazakh princes respected Muslim institutions, and as they advanced southward into the cities of Syr Darya, they openly courted the Muslim clergy. Such contact increased their knowledge of Islam. By the end of the 17th century, Kazakh oral literature included poems venerating Allah and Muhammad. The Code of Tauk also shows that the Kazakhs had accepted some of the principles of Sharia law by the end of the 17th century. The Kazakhs appear to have been introduced through the Uzbek example. There is no evidence that they actually understood the moral precepts on which the laws were based. It seems unlikely that there was any sort of formal Muslim religious establishment in the steppe at this time. The proof most often cited is that before the Russian conquest the Kazakhs did not collect the Muslim tithes on livestock, zakat, or on grain, ashur. Plan for the seminar. Periodization of the Kazakh history/civilization. Kazakhstan in Mongol era. Middle Age governments in 14-15 centuries.